Welcome back to the History of the Church. We're going to continue off where we left off. The last few episodes we talked about the councils and we talked briefly about Chalcedon, and we're going to talk with Abuna. Welcome Abuna once again. Would you like to continue with the Chalcedon?
Yeah, so we were talking last time about how certain interests met between the See of Rome and Constantinople and the issue that they had with Alexandria, especially Constantinople as the imperial city, and the politics of the time that sort of put Constantinople in a position where they had to assert their position in the church. And it's during that time that also we could start to see the roots of a misunderstanding. This is something that comes later, even in the 20th century when we start to talk about it, where each side is now using certain terms that they hear from the other and want to say that they're heretics. So the Constantinopolitan position was they talked about Christ in two natures, and as we said before, Alexandria didn't like that because they felt when we say in two natures, we feel that that's Nestorian, that's sort of splitting Jesus into two people. And then when Alexandrian bishops talk about Christ is one nature, the people in Constantinople hear one nature, then you're saying it's divine, therefore you're talking about eutyches, where the idea that Christ wasn't fully human. So there's these two extremes that we're hearing from each other when we're actually trying to affirm that Christ is fully God and fully human, and where we would call the Constantinopolitans and say, you believe in two Christs, and where they would come back and say, you're Monophysites, you believe in only one divine nature. So these two extremes start to become accusations that both churches start to accuse each other. That develops after this point, where Constantinople says, we need a new council to define the faith, and we need to affirm the faith that we all received. So they bring Pope Dioscorus to Constantinople, and they gather after that they move to Chalcedon in 451 AD, and they say, we want to define the faith. So Dioscorus, the Pope of Alexandria, who in our church we revere as a saint, starts to say that there is nothing left to define. We have already said that Christ is from two natures, and if we say anything else, that's Nestorianism. But the delegates at Constantinople, from Constantinople and especially the emperor and the empress, start to say that we need to put Saint Dioscorus on trial, because we feel that he reinstated Eutyches, and Eutyches is a heretic, therefore Dioscorus believes in the same heresy as Eutyches.
So now they're all completely against Alexandria.
Yeah, exactly. And at the same time, they start to come up with these stories of, Pope Dioscorus forced the people at Ephesus II to sign agreement with his decision under the threat of weapons, of arms. And Dioscorus said, where on earth would that would have happened? We didn't force anybody. So a lot of accusations start to come out. And then they say, you unjustly deposed Flavian, who was the bishop of Constantinople, even though he didn't say anything wrong. And Dioscorus says, he was saying something that I believe is Nestorian. And these accusations start to go back and forth. And no matter what the discussions go back and forth with, it seemed that, at least from the Coptic opinion, or the Coptic stance, that the purpose was already set. They had to, put Pope Dioscorus in his place. But what's interesting is that they finally depose Pope Dioscorus from his position.
What do you mean by depose?
Depose, that they say he's no longer patriarch.
Okay.
And they say that he's no longer the Patriarch of Alexandria, and we will put a more clear definition of the faith. And that definition of the faith comes from the Tome of Leo. So the Tome of Leo was used in this council in Chalcedon as one of the bases through which they wanted to define the faith. And they started to say, Christ is in two natures. And the Alexandrians don't accept that, and that's where we start to see the idea of a schism. But interestingly enough, Pope Dioscorus is not excommunicated or deposed because of a heresy. Even in the minutes of the meeting, so to speak, the minutes of the council, they say he is deposed for administrative violations.
So what do you mean by administrative?
Okay, so administrative violation, basically, there's a difference between saying that someone is a heretic and he has the wrong faith, versus he did something in the church from an administrative perspective that was wrong. So basically they're saying he's not a heretic, but he did some wrong things, where they said, for example, he deposed the Constantinopolitan Patriarch unjustly, and he did not follow the correct procedure. So that's why he was deposed, and he was actually even exiled after that. He was exiled to a place in Asia Minor, which is now, Turkey, and actually Pope Dioscorus died in exile. So the council ends, and the Egyptian bishops that are following Alexandria felt there was two problems: that Saint Dioscorus was wrongly deposed, and worse, from their opinion, that this new faith that feels Nestorian. That's from the Alexandrian perspective. And from the Constantinopolitan perspective and the Roman perspective, they felt that Pope Dioscorus had done so many wrong mistakes, and he was not being, he was being a Monophysite, where they felt that he was still in line with Eutyches the heretic. And that's why even until today, you hear people that call the Coptic Church a Monophysite church, where they believe that we don't believe in the full humanity of Jesus Christ. So that's where we say, no, we're not Monophysite with that. When we say one nature, we say it is one united nature, both human and divine. So unfortunately, there were some attempts after that, after Chalcedon, to bring back the churches together. There's several times over, like maybe 150 years after, where every now and then a new emperor would come and try to proclaim a faith that everyone would accept. But ultimately, a lot of these attempts would fail. And unfortunately, the way it ends is that in Alexandria, even until today, you have two patriarchs. You have one, the Coptic Patriarch, which is the church we belong to, that did not accept Chalcedon. And then we have what we would call a Chalcedonian Patriarch, or a Melkite Patriarch. Melkite meaning belonging to the king or to the emperor. So the emperor would send another patriarch who would accept Chalcedon, and he would have his own churches. And the Copts would not accept that patriarch, and they would only have their own patriarch. So you'd have two parallel churches, and they exist until today. The same thing happened in Antioch, where you have an Antiochian Syriac bishop, and they're in full communion with us as the Copts. And then you have a Melkite Chalcedonian bishop. So now there's non-Chalcedonian and Chalcedonian. And that's the first split that happens in the church. You find a split between the Chalcedonians, who are the Romans and the Constantinopolitans, and the churches that followed them. Even in Alexandria and Antioch, the people who followed that. And then you have the non-Chalcedonians, which today are the Copts, the Syrians, the Ethiopians, the Indians, and the Armenians. Those are the main churches that follow the non-Chalcedonian faith, and today they're called the Oriental Orthodox churches. And then you have the Eastern Orthodox churches and the Roman churches who accepted Chalcedon, and that's the first unfortunate split that happens in the history of the church.
So can we just summarize how we got to this point?
All right, so how we got to where we are today, as we said, there's now eventually what would become three main branches of Christianity, or three main denominations, which would be the Oriental Orthodox, that's the Copts, the Ethiopians, the Syrians, the Armenians, the Indians, and then we have what we call the Eastern Orthodox, which is the Greeks and Eastern Europe, and eventually after that Russia, and then Rome, which is the Roman Catholics. So up until 451, Rome and Constantinople were still together as one church, and they're called the Chalcedonians. and we're the non-Chalcedonians, as the Copts and the other churches that are like us in the faith. And we're now at this stage where there's one split between two groups of churches, the Orientals and the Roman Empire. And several attempts try to bring these churches together again from 451 until around 641.
So then what happens at 641?
So in 641, the Arabs enter Egypt and they conquer it. So maybe a few years before that, they had invaded Syria. So these were the two main places that had problems with the empire and the Chalcedonian definition of the faith. So the Arabs swept into Syria and Palestine and went into Egypt. And at that point, all the attempts stopped, simply because the connection between those areas that became part of the Arab Islamic Empire became completely disconnected from the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire lost these regions, and you couldn't have any communication because, you know, the Arab Empire and the Roman Empire were enemies. So you can't have communication between the Christians and the Roman Empire because that would be considered kind of treason. So you have that separation at that time, and you no longer have communication between those two churches on a serious level of trying to reunite until actually the 20th century. So in the middle of the 20th century, here in America, you find that the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, which is us, start to meet together and try to re-understand together what happened and try to find a way back to unity.
So is that what's happening right now with like the different contracts or like the popes coming together?
Yeah, we see that today, and we see, for example, where our Pope Tawadros would go visit Greece, would go visit Russia. Those are the two main, for example, the two main centers of Eastern Orthodoxy. And there would be all these visits, people like, for example, earlier this year when we had the Patriarch of Constantinople coming to visit Egypt as well. So these are all very nice attempts where we all try to sit together and say, can we all understand the faith in the same way and then be brought together as one faith?
So the Patriarch of Constantinople, is that also the Catholic Patriarch?
No,
or
so
different?
Today, the way this exists, you have the Pope of Rome, and that's the Roman Catholic Church. And then you have the Eastern Orthodox, and their spiritual leader is the Patriarch of Constantinople. And then you have the Oriental Orthodox, which is us, which would be the Copts, mainly the Copts and the Syrians and the Ethiopians, and the Armenians. And then there's also the Indians, and there's the Eritreans. So these are the Oriental Orthodox. So when we talk about Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian, it's Rome and Constantinople on one side, and Egypt and Syria on the other, and Armenia and some other countries as well. So that's what we're trying to bring together today. But its roots is in the history back in the 5th century, as we were explaining right now.
Well, thank you so much, Abuna. We've learned so much. And next time we will continue on with the history of the church, and we hope to gain some more knowledge. Thank you.